How the super empath quietly gets everything they need from avoidance. That sounds backwards, doesn't it? Because if you asked most people who holds the power in these connections, they would probably point to the person who leaves the text unanswered, the person who needs more space, the person who disappears when things get too emotional, the person who always seems just out of reach. From the outside, that person looks untouchable. They look calm while everyone else is struggling. They look independent while everyone else is trying harder. They look like they have all the leverage. But what if the biggest illusion in these relationships is believing that distance equals power? What if the person who appears least invested is not actually controlling the connection at all? And what if the super empath, the one who feels deeply, loves deeply, and understands people better than most, has been holding a kind of influence they never even realized they had? Today we're diving into a truth that completely changes the way most people see avoidance and empaths. Because the moment a super empath stops giving away their emotional energy for free, something fascinating begins to happen. And before we get into it, if these videos help you understand relationship dynamics in a way that finally makes things click, consider subscribing. That way you won't have to rely on an avoidant suddenly becoming emotionally available to find your next breakthrough. The first thing the super empath eventually realizes is that many avoidants move through relationships expecting pursuit, not because they're evil, not because they're consciously manipulating anyone, but because it becomes familiar. When tension appears, someone chases. When distance appears, someone reaches. When confusion appears, someone explains. Over time, this pattern becomes so normal that it almost feels invisible. The avoidant pulls away. The other person moves closer. The avoidant becomes uncertain. The other person reassures. The avoidant withdraws emotionally. The other person works even harder to reconnect. And slowly, without anyone intending it, a relationship can become emotionally lopsided. One person is carrying the weight of maintaining closeness, while the other grows accustomed to receiving that effort. The super empath often enters this dynamic with good intentions. They believe understanding creates connection. They believe patience creates safety. They believe enough love can solve distance. So they explain, accommodate, forgive, adapt, and try to understand every silence. What they don't initially realize is that every time they rush in to close the gap, they prevent the avoidant from ever fully experiencing the gap themselves. The relationship becomes predictable. The avoidant knows that eventually the empath will come back with another conversation, another reassurance, another attempt to reconnect. And when something becomes predictable, it often becomes undervalued. Then one day, something changes. Not because the empath becomes cold, not because they stop caring, not because they decide to play games. The change is much quieter than that. It begins when they stop volunteering for a role they never agreed to play. They stop being the permanent fixer. They stop being the emotional translator. They stop carrying responsibility for two people's feelings. And perhaps most importantly, they stop believing that love must be earned through endless effort. This moment rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no grand speech, no angry ultimatum, no emotional explosion. In fact, the avoidant may not even notice it immediately. But the energy shifts. The empath no longer feels compelled to chase every moment of distance. They no longer panic when communication slows down. They no longer treat every withdrawal as an emergency requiring immediate intervention. For the first time, they allow the avoidant to sit with their own choices. And that is where the entire dynamic begins to transform. Because when someone has spent years expecting pursuit, the absence of pursuit feels surprisingly loud. What happens next confuses many avoidants. They assume the empath will eventually return to the old pattern. They expect another emotional check-in, another explanation, another attempt to restore closeness. But instead they encounter something unfamiliar: silence. Not angry silence, not manipulative silence, just peaceful silence. The kind that comes from someone who is no longer trying to force outcomes. And here's where things become psychologically fascinating. Pressure often pushes avoidance further away. The more they feel chased, the more they feel trapped. The more they feel trapped, the more they withdraw. Yet silence creates a completely different experience. Silence leaves room for thought. Silence leaves room for curiosity. Silence removes the external pressure that once allowed them to focus entirely on escape. Suddenly there is space, and within that space, questions begin to emerge. Why aren't they reaching out? Why aren't they trying harder? Why do they seem okay? Why does this feel different? The super empath discovers that not every feeling needs immediate expression. Not every problem requires immediate discussion. Not every distance requires immediate pursuit. Sometimes the strongest message is allowing reality to speak for itself. And reality begins speaking very clearly when the empath stops filling every empty space with effort. As this unfolds, something even more important happens. The empath starts turning inward. For years, much of their emotional energy may have been focused on understanding another person, decoding another person's behavior, anticipating another person's needs, waiting for another person's availability. But now that energy has somewhere else to go. It returns home. They begin investing in their own life, their own growth, their own friendships, their own purpose, their own peace. They stop measuring their worth through someone else's consistency. They stop waiting for permission to feel fulfilled. And this is the moment many avoidants become unexpectedly fascinated, because independence carries a kind of quiet magnetism. When someone genuinely enjoys their life without needing constant validation, they become difficult to predict. They become difficult to control. More importantly, they become difficult to take for granted. The super empath isn't trying to create attraction. They aren't following a strategy. They aren't performing confidence. They're simply reclaiming parts of themselves that were neglected while they were busy managing the relationship. And ironically, this often creates the very respect, attention, and curiosity they spent years trying to earn through effort. Because people tend to notice what no longer revolves around them. They notice what they can no longer assume will always be there. And the avoidant, perhaps for the first time, begins to see the empath not as a permanent source of emotional availability, but as a complete person whose life continues moving forward with or without their participation. And this is where the super empath reaches a crossroads that many people never fully understand. Once they begin building a life that no longer revolves around managing someone else's emotional availability, they start noticing something uncomfortable. They start seeing all the little moments where they accepted less than they deserved, not because they lacked standards, but because they kept confusing potential with reality. They saw what the relationship could become, what the avoidant might eventually offer, what the future might look like if enough healing happened. But the super empath slowly learns that a relationship cannot survive on future promises alone. It has to exist in the present. And that realization changes everything. The scraps of attention that once felt meaningful begin to feel strangely empty. The occasional affectionate message, the brief bursts of closeness, the moments of connection followed by long stretches of emotional distance. These things no longer satisfy the same way they once did. The empath isn't becoming demanding. They're becoming honest. They are finally acknowledging that emotional breadcrumbs can never replace emotional consistency. And the fascinating thing is that they rarely announce this shift. They don't create a list of demands. They don't threaten to leave. They simply stop rewarding behavior that leaves them feeling unseen. They stop celebrating the bare minimum as if it were extraordinary effort, quietly without confrontation. Their standards rise. And when standards rise, dynamics begin to change. The avoidant often notices this before they understand it. Something feels different, even if they cannot immediately identify what. The familiar reactions are gone. The empath no longer lights up at every small gesture. They no longer seem endlessly grateful for moments of attention. They no longer appear emotionally dependent on every interaction. As a result, the avoidant begins watching more closely. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology. Many people assume avoidants stop paying attention when they pull away. In reality, distance often increases observation. They may not express it, they may not talk about it, they may not even consciously recognize it, but they notice changes. They notice when someone's energy shifts. They notice when someone becomes less reactive. They notice when someone stops chasing. They notice when someone's world appears fuller and more meaningful. Suddenly, the person who was once predictable becomes difficult to read, and uncertainty creates curiosity. The avoidant begins looking for clues. They wonder what's changed. They wonder what the empath is thinking. They wonder why the old emotional formulas no longer produce the same results. The more self-contained the empath becomes, the more attention they unintentionally attract. Not because they are playing hard to get, but because genuine self-respect always creates a different presence. It changes the emotional atmosphere of every interaction. What makes this shift even more powerful is that the super empath stops reacting from emotional urgency. For years, they may have felt responsible for preserving connection at all costs. Every withdrawal felt alarming. Every mixed signal felt important. Every period of silence felt like something that needed immediate action. But now there is a steadiness that wasn't there before. The avoidant says something confusing, and the empath doesn't spiral. Communication slows down, and the empath doesn't abandon themselves. A moment of distance appears, and the empath doesn't immediately rush to close it. Instead, they remain grounded in their own reality. And this emotional stability creates something avoidants secretly crave but rarely know how to ask for: safety. Not the kind of safety that comes from endless reassurance, the kind that comes from emotional consistency, the kind that comes from someone who is not constantly escalating situations, demanding certainty, or forcing vulnerability. Ironically, the more emotionally regulated the empath becomes, the more comfortable the avoidant often feels in their presence. Because they no longer associate connection with pressure. They no longer feel like every interaction carries an invisible obligation. They begin experiencing the empath differently. Less as someone trying to pull them somewhere they aren't ready to go, and more as someone who simply exists with confidence and calm. That stability becomes magnetic, because it cannot be manipulated, shaken, or controlled through inconsistency. And then comes one of the hardest lessons the super empath ever learns. They stop trying to be understood by someone who has already been given every opportunity to understand them. For many empaths, this realization takes years. They keep explaining because they believe the problem is clarity. If only they could find the right words. If only they could communicate their feelings differently. If only they could make their experience easier to grasp. But eventually exhaustion teaches what effort never could. Understanding cannot be forced. No amount of explaining can create willingness where willingness does not already exist. So the empath begins letting go of the endless presentations, the emotional essays, the repeated attempts to translate their pain into language the other person will finally hear. They realize that people reveal their level of understanding through behavior, not through promises. Through consistency, not through intentions. And when they stop trying to convince someone to understand them, something unexpected happens. Their dignity returns, their emotional energy returns, their sense of self returns. They stop standing in front of a closed door trying to explain why it should open. Instead, they continue walking forward. This isn't bitterness. It isn't resentment. It's acceptance. And acceptance carries a kind of peace that constant explanation never can. For the avoidant, however, this creates an entirely new experience. Not a dramatic absence, not a breakup, not a final goodbye, something much subtler. The absence of guaranteed emotional access. The absence of knowing that the empath will always be available to process, repair, pursue, and reconnect. And that absence has a strange effect. It forces awareness. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant begins experiencing the true emotional weight of the empath's presence by noticing what life feels like when that presence is no longer constantly offered. The daily reassurance isn't there. The emotional safety net isn't there. The endless patience isn't there in the same way. Suddenly, the things that once seemed ordinary begin to reveal their value. This is why the super empath quietly gets so much of what they need without demanding it, because the moment they stop overextending themselves, people are finally able to experience the real cost of their absence. Not through punishment, not through manipulation, but through contrast. Human beings often understand value most clearly when constant access disappears. And as the avoidant sits with that contrast, something begins shifting beneath the surface. Curiosity becomes reflection. Reflection becomes awareness. Awareness becomes effort. And for the first time in a very long time, the emotional gravity inside the relationship starts moving in a completely different direction. What makes this shift so powerful is that the super empath eventually discovers something that once felt impossible. They can care deeply without carrying someone. For most of their life, caring and carrying felt like the same thing. If they loved someone, they felt responsible for helping them heal. If they understood someone's wounds, they felt obligated to compensate for them. If they saw pain beneath someone's behavior, they gave endless grace. But maturity brings a different kind of wisdom. It teaches that compassion does not require self-abandonment. It teaches that understanding someone's struggles does not mean accepting every consequence of those struggles. And most importantly, it teaches that detachment is not the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love. Detachment is something entirely different. Detachment says, I care about you, but I will not lose myself trying to save you. It says, I hope you grow, but your growth is not my responsibility. It says, I can wish you well without attaching my happiness to your choices. For the super empath, this realization feels like finally putting down a weight they didn't realize they had been carrying for years. The relationship stops feeling like a project. It stops feeling like a puzzle that must be solved. It stops feeling like a test of endurance. And when that happens, they become emotionally lighter, more peaceful, more present. The irony is that this version of the empath often becomes far more attractive to the avoidant than the version who is constantly trying to hold everything together. Because now the avoidant is facing something unfamiliar. The emotional atmosphere has changed. The old imbalance is gone. The empath is no longer compensating for every gap in the connection. And slowly, almost reluctantly at first, the avoidant begins bringing more energy into the relationship. not necessarily because someone demanded it, not because an ultimatum forced it, but because relationships naturally reveal who is contributing when one person stops doing all the work. Conversations that once felt one-sided begin to shift. Messages appear more frequently, efforts become slightly more intentional, small acts of consideration emerge where there was once passivity. It doesn't always happen dramatically. In fact, some avoidants hardly realize they are doing it. They simply begin moving toward the connection instead of assuming the connection will always move toward them. This is one of the hidden truths many people miss. The super empath gets more effort not by asking endlessly for effort, but by creating a situation where effort becomes necessary. When someone is no longer over-functioning, everyone else must either step forward or step away. And that reality often reveals far more than years of emotional conversations ever could. The avoidant begins learning what the relationship actually requires because they can no longer rely on the empath to provide everything. But beneath these changes lies a fear that many avoidants rarely acknowledge, even to themselves. On the surface, they often appear comfortable with distance, comfortable with independence, comfortable with space. Yet underneath those defenses can exist a fear that looks surprisingly similar to the fears they trigger in others. The fear of being forgotten, the fear of being replaced, the fear of realizing someone continued their life without them. The fear of discovering that the emotional safety they quietly depended on is no longer guaranteed. This fear is rarely expressed openly because avoidants often protect themselves by staying disconnected from vulnerable emotions. But the fear still exists, and when the super empath begins thriving independently, that fear can quietly awaken. The avoidant notices that the empath no longer seems frozen in place waiting for them. They notice that joy still exists, growth still exists, connection still exists. Life continues moving forward, and that realization can be deeply unsettling. Not because the avoidant wants control, but because they suddenly see something they hadn't fully appreciated before. They see that the empath had options all along. They see that the person they assumed would always be there was choosing to be there. And there is a profound difference between those two realities. One creates entitlement, the other creates appreciation. As the empath continues growing, another unexpected